Afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me back there? Yeah? Nobody nodded, so I'm gonna. All right. My name is Jill Lane. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at NYU, and I am truly humbled to be opening an event that will celebrate the career and the work of our founder, our first director of the center. And I have, as I've been reading about Cal Silvert and reading some of his work, I've come to feel all the more honored to be walking in some way in his footsteps these many years later. It's my task simply to welcome you, and I wanted to particularly welcome Cal Silvert's family. There's a number of you here. We're so delighted to have you. We're so delighted that you could join us on this occasion, and it means a great deal to us to be able to share this moment with you. And I also wanted to thank, on behalf of CLACS, thank Chris Mitchell, who is a long-term director of the center for many, many years, and who brought this event to us, proposed it, organized us, animated us, motivated us, and we're really, really thrilled to be able to have this celebration. CLACS is a Title VI National Resource Center, and I was it's been very interesting to think about 50 years of Latin American studies, 50 years of these federally funded centers. And I felt I had a special connection with Cal as I was going through the university archives and reading his memos to the university leadership, complaining that they weren't supporting his efforts quite sufficiently. So as much as we know that NYU, we hope, was a great and supportive home to him in the final years of his career, he suffered the fate of all directors of this center of having to advocate for a great deal to make it possible to host a federally funded center here. And we've been carrying that forward since then as well. With no further ado, I leave the microphone to Martin Weinstein. Martin, will you be introducing yourself a little bit, or shall I introduce you?
No, I will just briefly state, I hope you all got that wonderful little program, which will save a lot of time of introducing everybody, but I want to thank some people first.
Absolutely.
Starting with Jill as the director, with Belle DeStefani of the staff here, and Omar Dawaje of the staff here also. I also want to especially thank Chris Mitchell for being the point person on this and really being instrumental in bringing this evening to fruition. The panel from my left is Chris Mitchell, Jorge Balán, and Abe Lowenthal. But before we begin, I would like to ask Henry Silvert to come forward to say a few words on behalf of the Silvert family.
Can everybody hear me? Thank you very much. It certainly is nice to be back at NYU. I did my doctorate degree a few decades ago in sociology. I would also like to thank Jill and Omar, and I would especially like to thank all the authors of the book, and especially Abe and Marty for doing their very good diligence at editorial work. My dad was probably the most sought after Latin American specialist in politics during his life. But interestingly enough, he often commented that while he was considered a political scientist here in the United States, in Latin America he was considered a sociologist. And this multidisciplinary approach that he had probably helped him and in many of his writings and many of his research, especially with one of his hunches about education, or hypotheses, if you like. He argued that educational attainment, the more educational attainment a person has, the more likely they are to work, to act and think in a democratic fashion. And this was a life endeavor of his. He researched this all throughout his life, from his first book on the Guatemalan government to his last book on the reasons for democracy. My brothers and I, Benjamin, who is sitting right there in the audience, and Alexander, who lives in Hawaii, had a front row seat to discussions about Latin America and world events. And we would participate often in these discussions. Friends, colleagues, students, foes would come over late in the afternoon and stay into the wee hours of the morning, discussing, debating, arguing, yelling, drinking wine, eating empanadas, about Latin American events, about Solzhenitsyn, about Russian politics, about European politics. And we, my brothers and I, were often welcomed into these discussions and arguments and yelling and fighting, and it was really great. Now, my brothers and I have obviously different memories of my father. I'm 7 years older than Benji and 10 years older than Ali, so they obviously don't have the same memories as I do. But I would like to share two of them with you, if you don't mind. First, you realize that Cal, like everybody else in this room, was multidimensional. He just wasn't tied down to his academic work. One of his pleasures was playing the violin. And so my first memory is about the violin. In New Orleans, when he was working at Tulane University and I was very young, he would play duets with my mother, Frida, who was a sociologist and also a pianist. And they would be playing music together. But the problem was that one of them, or maybe both of them sometimes, played a wrong note or counted incorrectly, so they would stop and they would argue. And this Socratic argument over and over again, and it went on and on and on, and the yelling and stuff like that. And well, that's the first part of my memory. The second part of my memory had to do with when my father had the string quartet over, and they were playing in the living room, and my father had a really, really weird idea that I was going to be another Mozart. So he had a violin made for me before we went down to New Orleans by Primavera in Philadelphia, a very famous violin maker, an eighth-size violin, just to fit me. And I would be playing next to his quartet. And I could read music quite well, and what's more important, I could count. So, so that was that. The second memory was many years later in Hanover, New Hampshire, where my father and mother were teaching at Dartmouth. And because of my physical condition, I couldn't play baseball, play basketball, run around very much. But so my father would make reading lists for me over the summer of my high school years. And I would read the books. We would discuss each book, chapter by chapter, sometimes page by page. And we would have this really great discussion. But, I would read, I don't know if any of you have run across Sabine's Anthology of Political Thought action. Well, it's 900 pages, more than 900 pages, and I was expected to read it all. And we discussed it. Of course, it's only a reference book. But these reading lists included Cassirer, Bolivar, Neruda, Marx, Smith, and I was only in high school, remember. It also included novels such as The Ugly American and the poetry of Dorothy Parker. And this was all in an effort to develop my intellectual authority. Many years later, when I was returning from Chile to Oxford, I stopped in Norwich to write my first draft of my dissertation on the Chilean left. This was in 1972. And my father and mother and I developed this idea of what democracy means. Democracy for us, in Chile at least, meant that a commitment to the maximization of individual and collective liberty. And what we argued was that the Chilean left was always committed to this. My father took this idea and extended it to include the whole world. And it's obvious that for those people who are not committed to democratic, to the maximization of individual and collective liberty, they are anti-democratic. So this really helped me out. He was teaching me things that I could learn on my own, but I probably would take much longer. In one of his books, I don't know whether it was the one with Leonard Reisman on education, class, and nation, or his little ditty on the reasons for democracy. He argues that September 11th, not 2001, but about 1973, Chile found itself in a crisis of democracy. I'm almost finished. I know, it went on a little bit too long, didn't I? And this crisis in capitalism was between those who espouse the wealth of the nation as the imminent process, and those who were interested in solely individual accumulation of wealth. I certainly hope that that's not the position that we are in today in this election. I just want to finish out with two thoughts. My father was known by everybody at NYU, but they didn't know that I was his son, usually. And one time I was with a professor of mine, and we were having coffee and donuts before class, and he said, you know, there was this guy by the name of Silvert in the political science department, and were you any relation to him? And I said, well, I'm his son. And this guy happened to work with my father in Brazil. I didn't know I was his son. But more to the point, and one that I really enjoyed, I met an old undergraduate professor of mine on the corner of Bleecker Street and LaGuardia Place. And he said, you know, there was a guy here who had the same last name as you had, and he died in the 1970s. Was he any relation? And I said, yes, he was my father. And he said, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't put two and two together. But, you know, I wasn't sorry at all. And neither would have my father been, because my father wanted me to develop my own intellectual credibility on my own. And he succeeded, I think. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Hank. My task is to keep these gentlemen to 10 minutes each so we can have a really good discussion, so I better keep myself to 10 minutes. Cal Silvert died at the young age of 56, much too early for everybody who knew him. His trajectory was really interesting. He took an undergraduate degree in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, and then he went off to World War II in the Army Air Force Intelligence, where he served in Africa. He had tremendous linguistic abilities, and he used Swahili and Arabic while in Africa. He came back probably contemplating that he was going to be a linguist or an anthropologist. Interestingly enough, fate intervened, and this is one of the two pieces of serendipity that I really want to leave you with. He was the best graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania in political science at this point. And the tradition was that they would ask their top graduate student to stay on and teach. It was 1947-48. They'd never asked a Jew to stay on and teach. They needed to get rid of him. So they said, Kalman Silvert, we have a Penfield Fellowship. You can go off and do your doctoral work. And he said, great. And off he went to Chile and did a doctoral dissertation, which he researched and wrote in 1 year on Corfo, the Chilean Development Corporation. And thus was born the Latin Americanist who became the first president of the Latin American Studies Association and the founding director of CLACS here at NYU. So that was one serendipity. The other serendipity has to do with the trajectory of how he got to NYU. He started teaching in 1948, right after he got his dissertation at Tulane, where he remained till 1961. But during those years, he did extensive travel to Latin America, short-term and longer-term, and got to know a lot of people and a lot of places. And a lot of people and a lot of places got to know him. And in 1961, Dartmouth offered him a professorship in government, and off he went to Dartmouth. At Dartmouth, from the research and some of the contributors to this book, what we learned was he had a remarkable group of graduate students at Dartmouth. And he was a Pied Piper in the classroom. Undergrads, I'm sorry. He didn't have that remarkable group of graduate students. I was one of them. And he was a Pied Piper, and he directed a lot of them. He hit that campus from the reminiscence that Lhasa published that we collected, like a firestorm in terms of what he demanded, what he had people reading, and he used anecdote and humor in the classroom in an extraordinarily effective manner in covering and opening you up to very sophisticated kinds of theory and analysis at the same time, making you appreciate it within the context of the various Latin American countries. So how did he get to NYU? He got to NYU because in 1967, the Ford Foundation asked him to join the Office for Latin American and Caribbean Affairs in the International Division as their social science advisor. He had been consulting for Ford since 1959, but they made him this offer in 1967, and it was an offer he couldn't refuse. But of course, he wanted to have an academic affiliation. I only know that two places looked at him really seriously. They were Columbia and NYU. And we have some of our Columbia colleagues in the room today. Columbia took a pass. They did not offer him a position. NYU said, we would love to have you. And we would love to have you, and you have 3 sons and help in the house, so we'll let you have a double apartment in what are now the Silver Towers. And so that's the second crossroads thing that led to Cal Silvert being at NYU. He arrived here in 1967. And as I pointed out, the classroom experience was remarkable, but there was something that was even more remarkable, which was his mentoring. And you got a bit of that flavor from Henry. But his mentoring and the business, and Henry also mentioned the late nights in the apartment. The Silverts ran a salon in that double apartment, and it was really remarkable. I'll throw out a few names that especially the older crowd in here will recognize. I first met Fernando Enrique Cardoso, Ricardo Lagos, Julio Cutler, and Guillermo O'Donnell in that apartment. One thing Hank should have added, but he may have been too young for that part of it. Even at 12:01, we would leave and go to Dante on McDougal Street, which was then a much better coffee house than it is now. All right? And if you want a personal story, I'd be sitting there, it was now 1:32, and I would say, I have to go out to William Patterson tomorrow to teach at 9:30. And he would look at me and say, you're young. What is the problem? So that's a bit of a reflection about that. What Cal Silvert instilled in his students were a number of things. Empathy, one of the most important. He wanted you to respect your subjects, and he wanted you to put yourself in their shoes. He emphasized competence. He said, you cannot be relevant. If you want to be relevant as a social scientist, you must be competent. And for him, that competence meant linguistically, methodologically, and basically, after you read everything, come back and talk to me. And he really did instill that in almost anyone who really took him and took what he was doing seriously and got him. He was intimidating in the classroom. I've had people who contributed to this book said, my first semester I said, I don't understand what he's talking about. What is he doing here? But you got it after a while. He knew that he was pushing and that you weren't going to get it all right away. I'm probably going to stop. I may have some more comments when we go on, but I will turn it over now to Chris Mitchell.
Well, thank you very much, Marty. My patch here is to talk about Kalman Silvert's scholarship in the laughable period of 10 minutes. Cal Silvert, it should be said, published over 1,500 pages of research in only a little more than 20 years. So it's this is, and some of it is complex indeed. So I can really just focus on a couple of themes that had special relevance for Cal, special salience for him, and also I think have endured as both lessons for us and in a way templates for the process through which many, many scholars today in the social sciences on the hemisphere and beyond are actually shaped. Cal's interest, as his scholarly interest and professional interest, as has been mentioned, was no less a field than the contemporary Latin America and its formation of his era. In politics, to I guess first and foremost, but also he was deeply interested in social and economic processes and structures of power. And in a minute I'll emphasize his interdisciplinary, the interdisciplinary instincts and really intellectual DNA that Cal had. He was the antithesis of the narrow political scientist who saw his discipline as somehow excelling or exceeding the capacities of others. As an undergrad and grad student at Harvard, I had literally been told by a faculty member that political science was the queen of the disciplines and that the others had to bob along in their wake. I didn't believe it then. Other people at Harvard said that's baloney. and I believe them. And Cal, I'm sure, never took that seriously. Cal was, as I came to think in getting ready for my chapter in this book and reading or rereading those 1,500 and more pages, he really should be described as having been a profound generalist about the region. He knew a great deal about particular societies, especially in the Southern Cone. He knew a great deal about issue areas such as education and political parties, but his role was to pull themes and analytic strands, often from the scholarship of others, which he freely acknowledged, together to situate the Latin American moment during the 40s into the 60s and 70s. That's not a role that it's very easy to play today, maybe not at all, for a whole bunch of reasons. But that was Cal's moment, and he was a focus of attention. I remember having his book, Expectant Peoples, assigned to me as an undergrad because people were paying attention in the broad professions. I'm going to focus on two aspects that emerge from that 10 or a dozen books and articles and letters and essays that particularly strike me as part of his legacy, most important in his legacy. His focus on democracy and freedom as vital policy goals, not as ideals to float somewhere in the empyrean, but rather as organizing concepts not only for one's hopes, but also for one's analysis. While other scholars were centering in those years on themes such as development, stability, or revolution in characterizing Latin America, Cal focused on liberty and equal participation in a polity relatively free of private appropriation of the public space. He viewed the pursuit of a multifaceted human freedom not only as a moral quest, but also as a key analytic tool. And as you read, I reread his works chronologically, so I could, in effect, watch his intellectual journey. It was just a fascinating process. And there came a time in the early 1960s when he came to the conclusion democracy is not just something, democracy and freedom are not just goals we should hope for, they are criteria that clarify, that snap into focus what's going on in many political and social situations. And he by doing that, he established for himself and others a moral and analytic ground from which the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes that came along in the last 10 years of Cal's life, in which they could be distinguished from yet another manifestation of pluralistic competition, which was pretty much the model that many scholars were using to analyze Latin America at the time. And those scholars, in the face of Pinochet and Onganía and others, were disarmed because maybe it was just another kind of intergroup competition. Cal was ready to say, no, this is the deprivation of the avenues to human freedom. And I think that bequeathed to scholars then and later the tools and the incentive to move on with the scholarly movements and political movements of human rights, transitions to democracy, And Cal really led the way, I think, on that, and his legacy is still with us. Second, and I know I must move along, Cal embraced interdisciplinary cooperation as I've said, in an almost instinctive way, and as Marty has indicated, was constantly focusing on the interplay between empirical data and rigorous discipline-based theory. He was a generalist, but he sought field data almost voraciously, and he encouraged and trained his students in that. One of his graduate courses here, which he taught every year, in addition to the full-time, very taxing job at Ford, was called Preparation for Field Research in Latin America. And when Cal stopped teaching it, very few people could be found to take that on, because it was an enormously testing task. He was constantly comparing ideas with data, with concepts from everything from political theory, reaching at least back to Kant and beyond, to contemporary models. I remember in the weeks when his book on education, class, and nation was published in 1976, I think the last year of his life, I've seldom seen him happier than when he said, "It's finally finished." This book had taken 10 years. It's finally finished, and it is his most elaborated, data-based defense of the theme that Hank spoke of, that is that increased education, other things being equal, tends to increase the chances for democratic behavior and democratic vocation. And these, one might think, well, interdisciplinary affiliations, of course, that's important, and theory and data naturally. But there are many, many obstacles, as people in this room can relate. Many obstacles to jumping beyond one's discipline and to undertaking the time and self-sacrifice that serious field work or any other kind of data collection that really gets you so that in my father's terms, he was a scholar too. Somebody would say, well, he really knows about that. That's a hard place to get to. Finally, I want to touch on something I haven't mentioned, but Hank did also, and that is that Cal cared greatly about democracy in America, democracy in the United States. His book, The Reason for Democracy, is in considerable part an outcry against the malfeasance of Watergate, the planning of the Vietnam War, the covert U.S. sponsorship for the coup in Chile and elsewhere in Latin America, Project Camelot, etc. And I think that recollection that struggling to maintain and improve democracy is a task here at home, here in the United States, as well as in the wider world, is something that in this year, 2016, we continue, and we know it, to need to take to heart. Thank you.
Jorge?
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing the book and making this presentation possible. I'm supposed to talk about Cal from a Latin American point of view. I guess in the book I hope, not the token Latin Americanist, but the only one who was born and raised and trained in Latin America before coming to this country. And I want to start by saying, that my exposure to Cal started very early in my life. late 50s, early 60s. I was a student of sociology in Buenos Aires, and he was a visiting professor. I was only 19, 20 years old. He looked very old to me, like most of my professors. But they were a young coterie of, they were not called graduate students, but younger assistants, people maybe 5 years older than me, who were really very much around him. And at that time, you know, the sociology department was a very small affair. There were very few, and it was a very intimate place. And Cal was particularly open. You know, actually was unusually open vis-a-vis other faculty. So we would spend time at his home. That's how I got to know Cal's children, and of course Frida very well. And part of the influence, and I'm supposed to talk about the influence, might have happened in his lectures, but I would say much more important were these conversations, which very much anticipated what Hank described of what was happening years later at Bleecker Street. Then I was lucky enough to, upon completion of my Ph.D. dissertation in '68 in Austin, Texas, to accept a job at NYU. And I vaguely knew that Cal was here, but really he didn't have anything to do with my hiring. I went to the sociology department, and when I came visiting, they expressed an interest in my interest in Latin America, and then I visited Cal. And of course he remembered me, I remembered him very well, but certainly had no hand in my coming, but was very important in my staying. I didn't stay very long, stayed for 3 years, but I was in very close interaction with Cal and Frida, partially again out of neighborhood. I lived on Bleecker Street, only a few floors below, and I spent a lot of time again in the evenings with the Silverts. I also was lucky enough that Cal took a year off, and he asked me to be his acting director. Of previous life of the center. It was called Ibero-American Language and Area Center, much smaller, modest kind of enterprise, which was what stood as area studies at that time. Then also unknowingly to him, I took a job with the Ford Foundation in Brazil. I mean, unknowingly, he knew about that, but he had absolutely nothing to do with my accepting a job there as a program advisor and visiting professor at the University of Minas Gerais. So I then knew Cal on a different role as the senior social science person in New York, and doing my work there, I had another kind of interaction. Then I left Brazil in '73 to go back to Argentina, and then again, I landed at the Instituto de Itela, one of the major Ford grantees, at a time of upheaval in Argentina and in Chile, and I was seeing Cal in his rescue efforts. So I'm not going to tell much of that story, but I wanted to tell you is that that gave me different angles of looking at Cal and different perspectives of what was then a rapidly changing world, a world that now, 50 years later, looks really very much in the past, and that a number of you, mainly students, would know out of the literature only, but sounds very, very far away. What I would like to do, since his work, published work, has been dealt with, and I would say without any kind of problem, that his published work was not the most influential part of his stay in Latin America, that I would focus on his personal relations. And that led to institutional development. And I'm going to skip the institutional part because that is most visible through institutions like the center here or LASA or you name it. I think that the most impressive thing for me was how this person could actually engage in debates and conversations with very different people, different generations, in a world that was deeply divided and very much in change. Let me remind you, social sciences in Latin America, late 50s, early 60s, was apparently a new thing, but it was not a new thing. It had been going on for a few decades, but it was going on under what I would call the European influence. European influence that was mainly learned through translation, mainly the Germans. If you look at the Fondo de Cultura Económica, what was publishing, or other, they were translating all the German big writers, including Weber, but not limited to Weber, Veblen and the others, I would say earlier than in the US. And they were kind of very influential also in bringing about a world that was full of German social science and philosophy at a time of what was known in Latin America as the anti-positivist revolution. It was, you have heard about that, I'm not going to go. But the important part is that at that time, 50s, 60s, the new thing, the new ball in the game was American sociology. And American sociology in the minds of Latin Americans was a very entirely different game. It was empirical, was largely atheoretical, not terribly illuminating of the deep problems of humanity. But nevertheless, it was there and it was very attractive. And in many circles, mainly younger circles, it was a new thing to do. Very few people, like my professor Gino Germani, could navigate between these two worlds easily. The younger people had greater difficulties. Add to that there is a third point in the triangle, namely Latin Americans' own production, which was varied, diverse, very often just commentary on the European authors, but at times with some degree of originality. Karl was probably one of the few people who was conversant in this triangle. And I include here the Americans and the Europeans, who were, of course, discussing with each other, but not with the Latin Americans. Or sometimes a few specialists could talk to the Latin Americans, but not across the Atlantic. Furthermore, among you have to remember that Latin America intellectually was a new thing. Not only Latin American studies here was a new thing. For Latin Americans, the idea there was something called Latin America, although it had been since the late 19th century, was not a very active idea. In Argentina, we didn't think about that. We thought about Argentina and Europe, Argentina and the US. And we were totally ignorant about Latin America. Well, Karl was not. Karl had fluency with countries like Guatemala, which we ignored, it was out of the map, or Chile, which was our neighbor, but about which we were equally ignorant. So not only he could help us triangulate these worlds of ideas that were rapidly changing, but could immerse us in a notion of Latin America that was not stereotypical, in the ways stereotypes were often repeated in the US. In the US until then, you know better than I, Latin America very often meant Mexico and little else, Central America, or Brazil as a very different country. But expertise on, it's only a few historians that can think of people like Dick Morse and other Latin Americans who could really be conversant about the diversity of the Latin American experience, and thus reject the stereotypes of traditional, modern, underdeveloped, developed, the kind of dichotomies the kind of relatively simplistic models, sometimes more sophisticated, a la Rostov or whoever, but who really could universalize to put together the human experience of development in a straitjacket. You know, that was the kind of world of ideas that Karl was consistently struggling with, criticizing, and I would say that the main influence he had on students and others, I would say not just in the late 50s, early 60s, but later on, was about the difficulties of this triangulation and the difficulties of looking within Latin America with a more nuanced perspective. But the 50s and 60s were still the area of hope and development in Latin America and in the US. And the questions were, when is it coming? How does it happen that it is not coming so fast? I mean, for Argentina and Chile, the whole obsession was, we are modern, but we are not developing. The ones developing seem to be Brazil and Mexico. They're not modern. What was wrong with that? Some of our first theoreticians were struggling with that kind of notion. Karl would, systematically engage you in some kind of criticism of that kind of simplistic modeling, whether highly sophisticated in the US or primitive in Argentina, but nevertheless simplistic, thanks to this kind of, I would say, broadly linguistic skill he brought to the table. Linguistic that implied speaking Spanish as a local, English, but also Swahili and other languages, and being knowledgeable about different countries, cultures, and respectful of them. Time is short, so I would say a couple of important points of why he was so influential in this period, and I'm limiting myself to a 15-year period. First of all, the world was changing. Latin America was changing from development to the crisis, dependencia, Cuban Revolution, so on and so forth. Things were getting more complicated. The world was getting more complicated. Karl remained the same person in terms of what was most important for him in his teaching and in his presence, namely values. His values didn't change. His belief in liberal democracy, which was not necessarily a very nice word in my quarters at that time, was unshaken. He could talk and respect a number of different perspectives, including the kind of very shallow Marxism that a number of us found attractive, but would engage with some knowledge about that and some ability to transcend the very, very narrow limits of these kinds of models. Now, being the same person implied, first of all, that his values were clear, and values included not only what we're talking about, democracy and freedom, but respect for scholarship, high regards for academia in the very good sense of the word, and in the sense that at that time was particularly important when foreign experts coming there wanted mainly to advise governments, and what they needed was people technically trained to work in government ministries. Be they economists, sociologists, doesn't matter. They need to be competent in some applied skills to be useful for development, but not necessarily critical minds, namely academics. He would put academia first, all the time. And that I sensed increasingly when I had an inkling of what his role at the Ford Foundation was becoming. I'm stopped there. Okay, thank you very much.
I will now turn it over to Abe Lowenthal, my co-conspirator on the book.
Used it to write up what I was going to say, and I have my notes here. But in the course of listening to my colleagues and realizing how many of the points I was going to make, not surprisingly, were made by others, I'm recasting what I want to say around two fundamental points. First, what occurs to me as one of the most important things in my mind and heart at the moment. And by the way, you know, some of you know me. I've been involved in a lot of different projects, and I think I've edited or co-edited some 15 books. I don't think any of them I have had the kind of emotional satisfaction that I had in this project, working with Marty and with our other colleagues in working on this appreciation of Kalman Silvert. And I'm struck that this meeting is so much in the spirit of Kalman Silvert as may have percolated already from the comments. In the short time I had with the refreshments beforehand, I noticed that, you know, even though I only knew a fraction, certainly less than half of the people in the space, and the space we're here now, but the ones I knew included economists, historians, political scientists, people with a background in literature and culture. They included people from Latin America and from the United States, and people with a broad cosmopolitan outlook. They're very much the kind of people who Kalman Silvert trained, brought together, interacted with. Jorge Balán's chapter in the book is really about Silvert as an interlocutor with Latin Americans of a particular generation. And that's one of the really fascinating things that comes out of this project. Beyond saying that we are here recreating that spirit of a very interesting and important figure in intellectual history, and particularly in the Latin American studies field, it occurs to me that what I really should do with my time available is to tell you a little bit more about this book, rather than to recount. I mean, I obviously could recount my own personal experiences with Kalman Silvert, from auditing his Harvard summer school course when I was taking Spanish for the first time because I was getting interested in Latin America, to working with him within the Ford Foundation and within the Commission on United States-Latin American Relations, the so-called Linowitz Commission, where Albert Fischler was also importantly involved, and various other experiences, lots of conversations and meals and so on and so forth. And there's a time and a place for that. But what strikes me is we all undertook this project in part simply out of respect, appreciation, admiration, affection for an important figure who touched each of us and who we think the actual genesis of the project was an observation and a conversation between Marty and myself that the Latin American Studies Association gives an award at each of its congresses every 18 months, and now it's every year, the Kalman Silvert Award for Lifetime Achievement in Latin American Studies. But we observed that most of the members of the Latin American Studies Association had no idea. They knew that there was a Kalman Silvert Award, but they had no idea who Kalman Silvert was. It's like Logan Airport in Boston. I've never met anyone who has any idea who Logan was, but we all go through Logan Airport. And we thought that quite apart from the emotional feeling about it, what I think really motivated many of us was the sense that the kinds of things of which you have a little bit of a flavor from what's been said so far, that marked Silvert's approach, his career, his contributions, are approaches and contributions that are very much needed today. This is not a book simply about a man who lived in a certain time, died too young, as was said, and had a collection of works and contributions, both academic in terms of his writing and institutional and broadly social and political. There was only the briefest mention of the Ford Foundation, for example, almost in the context of explaining why he was at NYU. A whole book could be written, and a magnificent chapter in the book exists to tell the reader about his role in, on, and through the Ford Foundation, where he was a really formative figure, changing the nature of the Ford Foundation's international role through first his work on Latin America and then his work elsewhere in the international division in interaction with his colleagues, turning the Ford Foundation from an organization that mainly focused on the technocratic expertise of development economists to one that really looked at the underlying social and political institutions and the capacity of people in other countries to be well trained and equipped to develop thinking about their own societies, to contribute what they were already doing in ways that made an impact on U.S. and European scholarship, which was a mark of that generation, and involved in very significant international interaction, which was not the case before Silvert and his generation. The two giant figures, I think, were Silvert and Albert Hirschman, and although there are many differences between them, I think that they deserve to be thought of in the same category and as formative figures. We think that the book is relevant to today's world and to today's students and young faculty. And a lot of you teach students, a lot of you are faculty, a lot of you are in institutional roles where you have a way of having an influence in this community. First, let me just say a bit more about the book and then a bit more about the relevance. I won't dwell on the chapters by my colleagues here since they've had an opportunity to speak about them. And I won't dwell on my own chapter, which is on Silvert and U.S.-Latin American relations and really traces how he thought about the relationship between the United States and United States policy in Latin America and how that evolved over time. I've mentioned the chapter on the Ford Foundation by Peter Cleaves, who was director of the Latin American Study at the Center at the University of Texas, but also a Ford Foundation official, and Richard Dye, who was a Ford Foundation official, then became vice president of the International Institute of Education. There's a chapter on Silvert's approach and methods by Daniel Levine, one of his students from Dartmouth, one of his most brilliant students, who has spent most of his career working on issues on the relationship between religion and politics, which subject he was turned onto by Kalman Silvert, and developed his own ideas, some of them quite critical of Silvert's ideas, and that tension animates his chapter and is very fascinating. Joel Jetkowitz worked very closely with Silvert on the work on education, and really looks at both the education and democratic theory aspects. In addition to Jorge Balán's fine contribution, there actually were two other Latin Americans who meet the category of being born and brought up and trained in Latin America. They should not be forgotten. Ricardo Lagos and Julio Cutler each contribute brief sections to the book, and they are very much part of that generation of people who had Silvert as an important interlocutor. Jorge, referring to his own experience, referred to Silvert's kind of colloquies about Marxism as it applied to Latin America, and his respect for looking at economic as well as sociological and anthropological and cultural factors in developing societies, but his feeling that the Marxist approach was had its problems of limits and excessive simplicity and really getting into mutually respectful back and forth on these issues that affected a lot of people. Lou Goodman, also a student of Silvert's at Dartmouth, has a chapter on Silvert and the American Dream, which is a very insightful chapter about the way in which Silvert, as a product of an immigrant family in the United States, really imbued with the American creed and American basic fundamental values, took them very seriously, and how they animated a lot of his approach. Morris Blackman and Ken Sharp have a chapter on Silvert as a public intellectual, and they emphasize as part of what they're talking about that Silvert's work was very much in the tradition of tikkun olam, the Jewish concept of repairing the world, and that one cannot understand Silvert's contributions without putting them into that context as well. In that spirit, let me say that I think part of the reason why Silvert's work is relevant today is that in our effort to educate people to do social science work in the different disciplines, we've gotten more and more rigorous, more and more able to apply techniques that put their finger on verifiable and falsifiable hypotheses and data. But sometimes we lose sight of fundamental questions, and particularly questions that matter beyond developing a scientific argument in a learned journal. And Silvert was very much about being rigorous and paying attention to methods and means of testing hypotheses, but he was fundamentally interested in urging people to pursue important questions, and feeling that the sort of degree of specialization within a cone loses some sense of important questions, that being in a caste that is that separates itself through jargon and formulas of various kinds got one away from really what the ultimate meaning of some of this work was about. And I think that's part of what my plea to you in the room would be, take a look at the book and see whether in looking at it you don't agree with me, that it would be terrific if people at NYU and other centers, Columbia and Yale and Tufts and various places that I see represented in the room, Occidental College, and so on, get some exposure for your students to Silvert as a role model for someone who really made a difference not only in the academic specialty, but in the application of this kind of thinking to solving and contributing to solving social problems. And I think that is an important part of the meaning. Finally, because I think this should be said, one of the things I think all of us appreciated even more as we worked on these chapters together than we did in our period of intense contact with Kalman Silvert was to understand that this was a remarkably integrated person with an integrity that goes beyond the usual meaning of the word integrity, in the sense of being a complete person where all of the different component parts contributed to each other. You've heard some of that if you're putting together the comments from Hank's comments on. As a father, as a husband, as a teacher and mentor, as a professor and administrator, as a foundation official, advisor, institution builder, president of LASA, as a member of a number of policy institutions and networks, the Brookings Institution, the Commission on U.S. Latin American Relations, the Carnegie Endowment, as a scholar and as a person whose passions were ignited in terms of enthusiasm as well as of rejection and concern as different things happen in the world. All of those different component parts played on each other. They were evident in the salons, but they were also evident in individual interaction. And he kept all these different parts kind of constantly reinforcing each other in ways that made him an inspiring figure. So my final sentence, some of you know this, I am a descendant of a line of rabbis. I decided when I was about 10 years old that I didn't want to be a rabbi, and I have successfully kept that pledge. But at this stage, and at the end of the formal part of the panel as we go into questions and discussion and comments, I am reverting to my rabbinic DNA in saying, in asking you to look at the book and share it with your students. It's in the spirit of believing that our mission in this book is to help contribute to the likelihood that the memory of Kalman Silvert will be a blessing and inspiration for future generations, not only for those of us who had the opportunity to know him well and work with him. Thank you.
Miracles happen. We have 15 minutes for discussion and comments. The floor is open. Otherwise, I'll tell a story.
In the back, you have something.
In the back. Yes, in the back. Either way.
I want to thank all of you for your work on the book and also for sharing all these experiences with us here. This is not a question. This is a testimonial of my own experience of Cal. Who was not my teacher and whom I didn't have the kind of close relationship that you've been hearing about. I had returned recently from Chile at the beginning of 1974, having been there for the coup and the period that followed it. And Cal called me into his Ford Foundation office. I was a young assistant professor at Princeton at the time, trying desperately to sort of somehow bring what I just witnessed in Chile into the classroom and other audiences. And he said, we are forming, he used the we, the kind of royal we, I think, under those circumstances. We are forming an emergency committee for aid to Latin American scholars. And I would like you to be the field representative. And before I could say yes or no, he said, of course you'll say yes. He went on to describe what my duties were, which essentially meant flying out each week to a different university, a different place, informing people about what was happening in South America, and trying to get places, fellowships, teaching positions, research positions that would enable scholars who were endangered to escape that danger and be in a position to continue their scholarship. And it was later in that conversation that he stopped and said to me, we must save the social sciences in Latin America. And it became clear that the reason behind that, this sort of democratization of his sociology of knowledge, was he said we must save Latin Americans' ability to analyze themselves. And to me, I think that was perhaps one of the fundamental goals that he had, one of the fundamental things he did in the Ford Foundation, and that long after he had passed from the scene, continued to be a concern of the foundation, and one of the roles that it played in country after country where, unfortunately, dictatorships replaced the democracies that Cal Silvert thought were in the wings. Thank you.
Anyone else have a comment or question? I could follow up Peter's comment then with one quick story. That was Peter Wynn from Tufts University. In 1974, I went back to Uruguay and Argentina. It was 1 year after the coup in Uruguay, and I was looking to publish my dissertation, which was being published in English, in Spanish, and I quickly found out that there was no market at that point in Uruguay anymore, and Argentina was not going to be a healthy market for my book either. But what happened in Uruguay was that I saw what 1 year of horrendous dictatorship had brought to Uruguay. And I came back and I went to see Cal. And I said, my friends are all been tortured. They've all been fired. I said, it's worse than Chile. And he looked at me and said, Marty, you're too close to it. You're too emotional. Take a step back. And then he said, look, I'm busy working on something. I'll talk to you tomorrow. As I went to the door, he turned around and he said to me, I can't save everybody. Thing is, he died trying. And what you need to know is that he died shortly after the coup in Argentina. His beloved Argentina took the same sad bureaucratic authoritarian path in those years. And Cal was due to testify on that in Congress and died of a massive heart attack just days, if not a week or two before. And Abe pinched hit, so to speak, and gave a testimony, and also gave a testimonial about Cal, a few paragraphs of which are in our introduction to the book. My story ends with the following. 2 or 3 years later, Jeff Perrier is a visiting scholar at NYU, thanks to Chris, working on a book. And I think it was on that occasion, or maybe a little bit later, that Jeff Perrier says to me, how are your friends so-and-so, so-and-so doing that? And he mentions 2 institutes. And I said, Jeff, how do you know, why are you mentioning those people, those institutes? And he said, because Cal funded them. He never told me. The last I heard was, I can't save everybody. But he ended up funding some of the people that I said, you know. He also did agree with me, this is a separate matter, but he did make a trip to Uruguay during the dictatorship in Uruguay, and when he came back he said, you were right. And by right, in the context of this comparative situation, Chile had a Catholic university. There were a little bit of space for people to be protected or saved in Chile, as bad as it was. There was no space to be protected in Uruguay. That's what he meant by the question of right. But I do believe that the coup in Chile was, in addition to his overweight, in addition to his chain smoking, in addition to his high blood pressure, I think the coup in Argentina killed him. That's my personal take on that situation.
have a couple of minutes left, and let me, since we're in the NYU setting, recall a few vignettes of Cal as a faculty member here, which I had the privilege of working with him for 5 years, from 1971 until his death in 1976. First of all, he was, even though he had this extremely taxing job on East 43rd Street, he was, as one would say in Spanish, very cumplido in not only meeting but setting a fine example of meeting all of his professorial and departmental responsibilities as a full professor of politics. Committee work, taxing committee work, the central, in the department's most stressful year of his time here, I believe, when the downsizing from University Heights took place. Cal was a member of the department's Personnel and Planning Committee, which was the central axis for all the political and departmental planning, which that year meant deciding the fates of many faculty, mostly junior, but not just. And he played an active and actually distinguished role in that time. He also was cut a remarkable figure in, and if you all in the academy will find this perhaps a comical notion, in Ph.D. oral exams. Not exactly an arena that brings out the best in most faculty members, perhaps. It's at best often a desultory affair. But Cal turned it into a teaching experience. He wouldn't neglect examining the student's grasp of everything from, not all of Sabine by any means, but the texts and findings and concepts that they had to have responsibility for. But he would, in an almost magical way, he would take it beyond that, so that what they had anticipated as a fearsome testing experience, and turned it into something that turned concepts upside down and took them apart and saw whether they would fit together in a different way. And everybody, including the other faculty members who had to be there and had their own set of questions to put, turned it into a really revelatory experience. Now, I didn't sit in on more than 2 or 3, perhaps, that Cal had, so maybe that wasn't a valid sample, but it was. But every time he was able to do that, and I think there's a great deal of truth in what Jorge said, that Cal's influence went well beyond the printed page. In certain ways, his personal impact transcended what he conveyed on the printed page, although, of course, he paid enormous respect to enduring scholarship, which you can pull off the shelf in Bope's library. And incidentally, not all, but some of his books continue to circulate actively. I used the Bope's copies in preparing my chapter, and Education, Class, and Nation circulates actively, and I had to wait for it. So the 40 years on, it's still exerting its influence.
Any other comments? Questions?
Thanks to all of you for giving
Wait, I have a question. I was going to ask you, who do you think are some of the Cal Silverts of this moment? Who do you think, aside from the present company, who do you think are some of the people who are not only doing scholarship research? I was wondering about the panel's view of who has risen to try to connect academic research and writing and teaching seriously with having an impact on institutions and on public policy. The way, are there other people who have come up in the Latin American studies area who we can look to, who are following, aside from the present people here, the four of you, that kind of role model for younger students and scholars?
Wow, that's,
Well, we have to rephrase
Okay, rephrase.
the question, and then, well, that world doesn't exist anymore. Area studies is not what it used to be. The need for this kind of linking worlds still exists, but not to the same extent. What remains, of course, is the desperate need for people who come up front with strong values and ideas and can follow that up both in the academic world and outside of it. My partial relationship with philanthropy in recent years at the Ford and elsewhere tells me again that profile has changed entirely. And of course you find absolutely bright people, but not with that kind of component, and I don't think there is much room for that. If we were going to run a competition to find out who could get this kind of prize, I wouldn't do that within LASA, or I wouldn't do that within any kind of equivalent world. That world has changed, and I think that we all have to be, we are necessarily subservient to the context in which we play. Even, you know, that's a bit of the sense I try to deliver. So I don't think I have an answer, but it's an important question.
His key time was the Cold War. And the key time was the Cold War and Latin America as a victim within the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes that emerged and were supported by the United States. So, you know, times change and the context changes. Project Camelot was mentioned. Most people in the U.S. Camelot was a project by U.S. Army to find out what makes people rebel. And a lot of social scientists signed on to do research on this in Latin America. And then one day, someone in Chile saw the U.S. Army stationery talking about Project Camelot. And I'm simplifying, but it blew it up. And when it blew up, what it blew up was the ability, and Cal was very nervous about this, and so was the graduate students, blew up the ability for you to go down there and not be seen prima facie as a spy, because this was a major project. This was a multi-million-dollar project in the 1960s, and so one of the values he instilled was that you had to really be ethical and be transparent as to who funds you, and et cetera, because he was very concerned. When I went to Uruguay to do my dissertation research, he wrote a letter to the Ramas, the sociologists and other people, and I remember the phrase, "No hay nada de Camelot en este hombre." he felt compelled to put that into a letter introducing me to people in Uruguay. And the more I got to know Uruguay, I realized why he better feel compelled to put that in a letter, because they assumed I was a spy.
Could I throw
I-
in excuse me.
Go ahead.
I thought it was a very important question. And I partially agree with Jorge. I agree that the incentives and structures, both in the academic world and in the worlds of institutions, government, and philanthropic, the incentive structures push in the opposite direction from what characterized Silvert. And that's why you say it's another era. But I don't think they make it impossible, and I don't think there are no examples. I think it's in the field of that we happen to work on, that is having to do with Latin America. The examples that come to mind most easily are not North Americans or people from the United States, but rather Latin Americans, people like Alejandro Foxley in Chile, or a number of Brazilians and Mexicans who, and from a number of other countries, who have a combination of some of these skills and interests and bridging. But I don't think they're absent in American academic and public life. They're not as many examples, I think, in the field of Latin American studies. I can think of some, but I don't sort of want to single the people out. But I think of Bob Putnam, for example, with a series of books, each of which puts its finger on a very important aspect of society, and based on very good research, his own and that of others, and then pointing out what needs to be done. And there are a number of other examples. I've just read a book recently that ultimately left me unsatisfied, because after a brilliant analysis, I think, I felt when he turned toward, what does this mean for the future and so on, he lost me. But it's a book on the fractured society about the United States, arguing that both liberal and conservative visions of the nature of the problems facing the United States are rooted in a gripping nostalgia for a past that was never quite what we remember, and that in any case isn't going to be recreated, and that we've got to take a different way of looking at the society. I think his analysis on that point was brilliant, but this fellow's name is Yuval Levin. But then what to do about it. So combining those aspects in a credible way is harder, but I think there are some examples. And in saying people ought to familiarize themselves with Silvert's career, I'm suggesting we need more of that sort of thing.
Just to take 30 seconds, your question, which is very thought-provoking, it did put me in mind of, speaking of bridging roles, that, of course, we live in a media-saturated environment where communications ability counts for so much and can have such a positive effect. And in certain ways, I think the linking or bridging roles have come to be played by figures from, or they contributed to by figures from humanities and the humanities and journalism, by figures who can sometimes, for due to accidents in their upbringing, are able to move easily or were able to move easily between Latin American and U.S. culture. Carlos Fuentes had that capacity in spades. Our colleague here at NYU, Jorge Castañeda, has exactly the same rare, deep grasp of the dynamics and moving parts in both spheres. Last but not least, at its celebratory dinner in May for the 50th anniversary of LASA, the speaker invited by the association to, as a kind of keynote speaker, was Alma Guillermo Prieto. Again, a person originally a dancer who has become a superb, insightful, committed, candid, eloquent journalist who can speak to both North and South. And that wasn't Cal's role, but he would be applauding.
Well, she went through anthropology,
Ah,
from the dancing to the anthropology, which was that's the bridging discipline,
Right,
I think.
to be sure, yes.
Thank you all. We hope we gave you a fruitful and provocative hour and a half, which is now an hour and 45 minutes.
Thanks, all of you.